Today we're going to talk about why people that are high achievers get depression. Before we start, there's a couple of caveats. The first thing to note is that being a high achiever does not necessarily give you or guarantee depression. In fact, being a high achiever and achieving your goals can be a mitigating or protective factor for reducing depression. What is really important to understand is that individual differences and individual mileage varies. So what it really means is that there's a general course or development over time that would lead a person that achieves highly or perhaps even overachieves down a pathway to depressive symptomology. So it's important to understand that each individual's mileage varies. So the most researched and well-established mechanism that predicts the depressive symptomology onset is called socially prescribed perfectionism. So what this means is what it kind of sounds like, where the individual has perfectionistic-like tendencies prescribed to them by the social environment. Now, usually this is in the context of parents, but it can be in the context of friends as well. To put it more simply, what it kind of means is the person is expected to behave in a flawless way. They have it inbuilt and ingrained into them at a young age, but it can be really at any age that they need that performance is expected to be perfect and flawless. So naturally, if a person is expected to behave in a flawless way, this can lead to the development of fears and avoidance behaviors, such as a fear of mistakes or a fear of not achieving or reaching that near high 100% standard that is imposed upon them. This is also known to make the person develop a very harsh internal critic. So they have a little voice in their head that's constantly criticizing their work and constantly telling them that this is not right, this is not correct, I need to do this better. Or the inverse, they might not even start the project for fear of not getting it perfect, basically right at the beginning. So they have this constant rumination cycle in their mind of got to perform extremely well, or I'm going to make a mistake, and if I make a mistake, I'm going to get in trouble. What can also happen is the person can develop this thing called contingent self-worth. So what this means is that their self-worth, their self-esteem depends on their external achievements. So a person that demands constant performance out of themselves will, if they achieve what they want, which high achievers do, they might decide that, well, my value as a person was derived from that external achievement and not because of my inherent worth as a person. So how it really leads into depression is via the following mechanism, because we're talking about high achievers here. So people that actually achieve their goals, right, to a very high standard as per the social standards in the culture of interest. So what happens is it's impossible to achieve 100% success, basically. There will always be mistakes. There will always be small errors that a person will make. It is literally impossible to achieve perfection and 100% accuracy forever. So what can happen is the high achiever will get, say, 95% or 90% on a test or something. And what that can lead to is, instead of them focusing on the 90 or 95% that they got, they might dwell and ruminate on the 5% thing that they got wrong. And then if they have a constant harsh critic in their mind constantly telling them what went wrong or how to be better, or not basically engaging in no self-compassion, then they're going to dwell on that 5%, and that could engulf their whole thinking process, and then that can spark depressive symptomology because they're basically discounting the positives and really only focusing on the negatives. What can also happen is if a person is demanding a high level of performance out of themselves, this can lead to a very extreme work ethic and potentially lead to strained social connections and social relationships. So the person with perfectionist tendencies, their work and their sort of goals might engulf their entire life, and they have this sort of this tunnel vision of the future, and other things like being social, having fun and all that sort of stuff take the back seat, and that can either strain existing relationships because others might not be as sort of determined as you, or they can just lead to straight up social disconnection because the person isn't going to, parties on the weekend. For example, they're spending all their time at home on a Saturday night studying or working on their entrepreneurship business. And of course, humans literally need friends or family, right? Like, social connections are the cornerstone of our existence, and without them, a person can potentially slip into depressive symptomology. And if the person with perfectionism has spent many months or years with this sort of tunnel vision focus on just the goal, this can lead to potentially can lead to long-term social isolation and loneliness, which predict depressive symptomology. You can potentially link it all in your mind pretty quickly, where if you have a person that is very much socially isolated and have this extreme perfectionistic tunnel vision towards the goal, and then they have a harsh internal critic in their mind that's constantly self-evaluating, then you can see or self-criticizing, you can see how this can predict depression, where the person is basically alone. They have minimal social connections, and they have constant self-criticism about themselves, about their past small, minute failures and shortcomings, discounting all the positives and focusing purely on all the things they did wrong. And with no one else around to really provide social support and social connection, they're just sort of left to their, internal rumination, negative thinking. And if your whole world is engulfed by self-criticism and negative thinking, then that can produce negative outlook on the future and the self and the world around you, which is of course depression. The other part to it too that's really useful to consider is back when I said talking about contingent self-worth, which is the idea that your value as a person is derived not from yourself but from the things you achieve. Well, if a high achiever has achieved all the things that they want to achieve, then they might, if they don't have internal validation and they rely on external validation, then of course, if there's nothing left to achieve, then they feel goalless. They might feel performanceless. They might feel like this is it. There's nothing left to do. Have I succeeded? Have I failed? Like, why is there nothing left to do? What am I supposed to just sit here now and be left to my internal self-critical thoughts? So without internal validation and being trained on the idea of external validation, that can also predict depressive symptomology later in life. Another important factor to cover is chronic stress. So what can happen is the person with socially prescribed perfectionism might, in a frantic effort to avoid making any mistakes, they might impose extreme work hours upon themselves, to the point where they have this chronic stress from trying to avoid making mistakes and trying to run away from the inevitability of making mistakes, which then can lead to burnout. Lastly, before I wrap the video, I want to briefly touch on this phenomenon called imposter syndrome. Now, it's not really exactly a clinical diagnosis term, but it's quite relevant to people across the world. So imposter syndrome refers to the idea that a person feels like they don't belong in a certain location, or they don't, and in the context of this, it's if a high achiever actually achieves what they want, which they do, they might feel like they're an imposter in the environment that they are in. They might feel like, I don't deserve to be here. So they eventually actually achieve what they want, but they don't feel like they deserve it, or they don't feel like they are worthy of this success that they've achieved, because they feel in it like an imposter, in part because of continuous self-criticism and self-evaluation. So to summarize, it's important to note that setting high standards for yourself and achieving those standards doesn't necessarily predict depression for people, and it can be quite the opposite. What is important to note is that it's really a combination of the factors that I've outlined here that could lead a person to developing depressive symptomology, where you have continuous external pressure combined with internal criticism, and social isolation, social disconnectedness can all sort of coalesce together and manifest into a person that gets what they want but feels like they don't deserve it.